Hey guys, in this video we'll be adding our nav bar and footer and potentially any other custom CSS styles that we need to facilitate our objectives. Now what we want to do is start shaping up our application. If we can recall, this is what we left off with a simple page that said hello world, but we probably want to add things like a navigation bar, a footer, and we want to, take the text or the content that we're going to be putting into the page away from the left margin a bit. So I'm just going to go over to getbootstrap.com, and then we can start looking at some of the components that we can start putting in. And I'm going to start with the navigation bar. So if I go to components and then go to nav bar, then I will see that they have some examples of nav bars available to us. So that's a gray one. I don't want my website to have a gray theme. I would want, here we go. We have a dark, we have blue, and we have light blue. So I'm going to use dark. So I'm going to take this nav bar code that is initializing a nav bar, and all it's saying is nav bar dash dark and bg dash dark. So I'm going to copy that bit of code, go over to my header.php file. So remember that header is going to be in charge of containing all of the code that should be at the top of every single page. So if I want my nav bar on every page, then I need only put that inside of my header file, header.php file. So any good application is very navigable, meaning you can get to anywhere from almost anywhere. And the nav bar is an excellent way of ensuring that. So I'm just going to add this nav bar to the header.php. So every page or file that references this page will know what to do. Now, in order to know what to fill in between the opening and closing nav tags, you can always just consult the documentation on navs, and they actually show you different examples. So you have a simple example here with a nav bar with 4 links, and you see that the nav tag is here. I mean, granted, it may look a little different because it's using the light theme instead of the dark theme, but essentially it's the same code. So I'm going to just take all of the contents of this nav and I'm going to insert it into my nav and spend some time fixing the indentation a bit. And then the first thing here is that it has an anchor tag that says navbar brand. That's a class, so that's coming from Bootstrap. But then the text here I'm going to put as school management. So of course you want to put a creative name. So you know what, I'm going to call mine Chest as well. I'm not going to be corny, so I'm going to leave it as school management, something nice and catchy. Of course, you can get creative and call your product what you want to call it, but that is going to be printed to the far left of the nav bar. And then we see here some other things about the toggling. So it's automatically responsive once you use Bootstrap, whereas when you have your nav bar, and I'm just going to use the Bootstrap website as an example, and you minimize or you reduce the screen size, meaning it's being loaded on a smaller screen, then you'll see that you get this square with those 3 bars. So that's what you call the nav bar. It's responsive, it scales to your screen, right? So that is what this line of code from button to button, that bit of code is actually just handling what happens when the screen size is reduced, essentially. All right, next we have a bunch of anchor tags, and each anchor tag represents a link on the website. So I have a link here that says home already. I'm going to put on one that says about to match to our about.php, and one that says contact. And I don't need a 4th one, at least not right now. I'm going to remove that, and I'm going to actually change the href, and I'm going to take off this active. All right, so all 3 links look the same way. And then home will always point to index.php. About will always point to about.php. and contact will always point to a contact.php. Actually want my navbar to be split in two. I want the links to the left and, well, a login button or link to the right. All right, so I'm going to do a little modification to this div that says navbar dash nav as its class, and I'm going to add another class that will say mr dash auto, and then I'm going to create another div with the same classes. So I'm just going to copy this one since it's already there, and instead I'm going to say ml dash auto, and of course I have to close this one correctly. Now what this is going to allow me to do is anything that is in the div, inside of the div with the class mr dash auto will automatically be to the left, and anything that is in the div with ml dash auto will automatically be to the right. So what I'm going to do is include an anchor tag that has the text login. So I'm actually going to take one of these and reproduce it in this tag. And then I'm just going to change some of the fonts. So obviously this href can't be that. So I'm going to put that back to a hashtag because we're not ready for that yet. And this one will say log in. All right. So having done all of that, I'm going to take a quick peek at my page to see what's rendered. And here I see that, okay, I have school management, but unfortunately, I'm only getting that the responsive menu. So I think I need to make some adjustments to this. So I'm going to go back to Bootstrap's documentation and see what it is that I missed out. And if I look at the earlier examples, then I would notice that the nav class has navbar dash expand dash lg, and then it has the theming references. But if I look back at my code, I did not put, sorry, that's the wrong window. I did not put navbar dash expand dash lg. So I'll just add that into my navbar, and then when I go back and refresh, then I see that it's now how I expect it. And if I change the screen size, then we'll see that it is responsive to that. All right, so that is, well, that's part of the battle done. We still have hello world being tacked on to the far left. So I don't want it to be so far left. I want it to be, to have a little margin between that. So Bootstrap gives us a class called container that I can add. So inside my body tag, I'm going to add a div. All right, and I'm just going to put a BR tag so that there's a little space between the nav and the body. But because if you notice, the hello world is like right there. All right, so if I refresh having put in that BR tag, you see that now there's a little space. So we have the BR tag, and then what I'm going to do is create a div. And then this div is going to have the class container. So Bootstrap gives us a class called container, which allows us to kind of create a nice little center. Instead of taking up 100% of the screen, because as it is, if I were to type out a full sentence, it would literally stretch from the far left to the far right. But I don't necessarily want it that far across. I want it from like maybe a little in from the left to a little in from the right. So container kind of does that for us. But of course, if we open the container tag, we have to close it, and we can't close it. We can't open it and close it inside of header, because that doesn't make any sense, because we want the content that is going to come after the inclusion of our header file to be inside the container. So I open it in the header, but then I go to footer, and then I close that div. So remember that, and I'm going to go back to the index page, we are including the header, so that's nav and the opening tag for the container. Then we're putting on all the content that we need, and then we say we close out. So then at the end of that, we would put in our closing div for the container div that was open. So in essence, when it's rendered, everything that we put here that h1 hello world represents would be in between the opening div and the closing div tag. So when we do that and I refresh, we'll see that hello world is now a little from the left, and well, it's all white spaces, so it's hard to tell, but it's in a little from the left, and if we were to type out, it would be a little from the right also. All right, so for now I can leave the header file. Next, I want to create a little footer. So underneath the div, I'm going to create another div, and I'm just going to open and close it at the same time. And then I'm going to call this one footer. So I'm going to give it ID equals footer. And then for the, now we can look at our Bootstrap documentation, and we would see that we have a section under utilities called colors. So for colors, you can actually choose the background color. All right. And then that allows us to add a few classes to any div and inherit their, well, default colors. So I want a dark footer to go with my dark navbar, and so I'll look for the appropriate one, which is BG dark. So I'll find that BG dark. So I can take the class, because I already have the div, I already created div footer. So I'm just going to take the class, go over to Visual Studio, paste that in. All right, so it's saying BG dark and text would be white. And then if I go back to my page and refresh, then I see that I now have this black bar that represents the footer. But notice how high up the footer is. So really and truly, a div is relative to this, well, a div's size is relative to the content that is put in it. So a div right now with hello world is not enough to force my footer down to the bottom of the page. And you may have seen previously where that is a recurring theme. So Bootstrap actually has a class called fixed dash bottom, which will force the footer as close to the bottom of the page as possible. So you might need to write some custom CSS to get rid of that empty, that extra space. But for now, we can leave it at that. So if we just look inside of our, well, let me just view page source so we can see everything that's happening. So we have our regular HTML template, and then we have our navbar, and then the navbar is not inside of the container, which is why it stretches from the extreme left to the extreme right of the page. All right. And then we have a container which we will put our content in, and then we close that container starting the footer page, and then we have our our div for the footer, and then the rest of the page, all of that inside of the footer.php file. And that's what kind of gives us this. So we want some text for our footer section, and I'm just going to write copyright and the year. So in our footer.php file, we'll just go ahead and we'll say something like copy, right? And then we'd want the @ sign, so we have to use some symbol. And well, instead of the @ sign, the copyright sign, so that's copy. So it's ampersand, copy, semicolon, and then I'm going to use a PHP tag right here. So it will look like one sentence, but what's happening is that we typed this, and then we will just say echo, because we want to print something, and we'll call a date function from PHP, and what we'll pass in is a capital Y, which would give us a 4-digit year figure. So if I do that and refresh, I see copyright and the copyright sign 2019. So I can add in more text. I'm going to say something like school management system, and save that, and there we go, 2019. All right. And then of course, if we wanted this to be center aligned, I always say put text inside of p tag. So I'll cut that, put it in a p tag, close the p tag, and then use a Bootstrap class which says text dash center, which then allows me to center align that text. And you notice that the p tag comes with its own bit of padding, so now the footer section kind of got a bit bigger. Now that we have our nav bar and footer set up, and as we go along, we may make changes, but this is good enough. The last thing I want to do is check in our latest changes. So I have GitHub for Desktop open here, and it is showing me all the changes that happened inside the files. And I'm just going to write a summary basically to say updated header and footer content, and then commit to master. And then once it's committed locally, we need to push it to our repo, and that would be that. So our code is now resident on both our machine, and I'll just do this and navigate over to our page, our GitHub repository, where we see updated header and footer content. So each time we make a change, once again, and check in and do our commits, then we'll be able to track and see the progress of the project as we go along. And the great thing is that if we made a mistake and we needed old code, we can always just go back to the commits and retrieve that exact commit that had the last good bit of code and retrieve it if necessary.